right. So, we're diving into this whole Budapest Memorandum thing today, and folks have been asking for, kind of like the full story on this. So we're going to
Yeah.
try to unpack that.
Yeah, this is it's one of those things where it's like international relations and
Yeah.
kind of the high stakes diplomacy and
Yeah.
and unfortunately like some hard lessons.
Yeah, for sure.
You know.
It's a wild one, for sure.
Yeah.
So to really kind of wrap our heads around this, we've got to rewind the clock a bit.
Okay.
Back to the early 90s.
Okay.
Soviet Union's just collapsed.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you got these former Soviet republics.
Yeah.
Ukraine,
Right.
Belarus, Kazakhstan,
Mm-hmm.
and they're sitting on a sizable nuclear arsenal.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about a recipe for global anxiety, right?
Well, and I mean, you can imagine like the rest of the world looking at this situation.
Oh, yeah.
Where you have these newly independent nations and
Right.
and they've got all this, leftover nuclear firepower.
Yeah.
It's a powder keg.
Yeah.
And, the Budapest Memorandum was really an attempt to try to like
Right.
diffuse that situation.
Yeah, to kind of like bring some stability to this whole thing.
Exactly.
So 1994, that's when this memorandum comes into play.
Okay.
And, the basic idea was to convince these countries to give up their nukes
Yeah.
in exchange for security guarantees.
Right.
So it's like a pretty fair trade when you put it like that.
On the surface, it does.
Right.
But as they often say, the devil's in the details.
Okay.
And this agreement was actually signed by Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan individually. Oh, really?
With Russia, the U.S., and the U.K.
Wow, okay.
So what's crucial here is, what exactly did they promise each other?
Right.
And I think maybe even more importantly, what did they not promise?
Okay, so let's break those promises down then.
Okay.
What exactly were Russia, the U.S., and the U.K. signing up for when they put pen to paper on this thing?
So they basically pledged to respect the independence,
Mm-hmm.
the sovereignty, and the existing borders of these three former Soviet states.
Okay.
So that meant no using force against them.
Gotcha.
No threatening them.
Right.
No using economic pressure to get their way.
Right.
They even promised to take it to the UN Security Council
Wow.
if any of these countries face threats involving nuclear weapons.
Okay, so they're really trying to cover all their bases here.
Yeah.
At least on paper, it sounds like a pretty solid deal. Right.
So at what point do things start to kind of, fall apart?
Well, I mean, it really all comes down to the wording.
Got it.
They use the word assurances in the document.
Okay.
And you can probably guess that that's not quite as strong as saying guarantee.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
What's the difference there, and why does it matter so much?
Well, think of it this way.
Okay.
An assurance is kind of like a handshake agreement.
Okay.
It's a serious promise, but it's not necessarily legally binding.
Uh-huh.
A guarantee, on the other hand, that's more like a signed, sealed, and delivered contract.
Okay.
It creates a legal obligation.
Gotcha.
And that one word choice that would come back to haunt this agreement.
So even back then, there was this kind of like built-in ambiguity about how far these countries would actually go to protect Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan.
Right.
Was that like a fatal flaw from the get-go, or did things just play out in a way no one could have predicted?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
For about 20 years, the Budapest Memorandum seemed to be holding Ukraine fully dismantled its nuclear arsenal, which was the third largest in the world at that time.
Wow.
And the agreement was hailed as a victory for nuclear non-proliferation.
Right. Makes sense.
But then 2014 happened.
Oh.
And the situation took a dramatic turn.
2014. That's when those assurances are really put to the test.
Yeah.
What happened that year that threw everything into question?
Well, Russia, in what I think can only be described as a clear violation of the Budapest Memorandum, annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. It was a bold move, and it sent shockwaves through the international community.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so 2014, huge turning point.
Yeah.
Russia annexes Crimea.
Right.
Directly goes against that promise to respect Ukraine's borders.
Yeah.
What was the global response like?
Yeah.
Did anybody try to enforce this Budapest Memorandum?
So you saw strong condemnations from a lot of Western countries, the US, the UK, Canada, a lot of the European Union. They imposed sanctions on Russia.
Okay.
Russia was even partially suspended from the G8.
But nobody actually stepped in militarily
Right.
to force Russia to back down.
Exactly. And that's where that ambiguity of the Budapest Memorandum, that distinction between assurances and guarantees, that really became the critical issue. There were no ironclad commitments.
Wow.
Yeah.
to use military force to defend Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It was ultimately a political agreement,
Right.
not a binding military pact.
So is the Budapest Memorandum like a failure then? Did Ukraine mess up by giving up its nukes
Yeah.
in exchange for these assurances?
I mean, that's a really complicated question.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
Some people argue that, Ukraine really miscalculated
Yeah.
by trusting those assurances.
Right.
Others say that, well, you know what, if they had kept their nuclear weapons,
Yeah.
that would have created a whole other set of problems.
Right. It's like a catch-22 almost.
Yeah,
So Crimea's annexed.
right.
What happens next?
Well,
Does the international community just kind of accept that this is the new reality?
not completely, no.
The annexation of Crimea really sparked this huge debate
Okay.
about what the Budapest Memorandum actually meant.
Yeah, like what is it actually worth at this point?
Yeah, like was it legally binding?
Right.
Or was it just a political agreement?
Mm-hmm.
Did the West fail to hold up their end of the bargain?
Right.
These questions were being debated like crazy.
So it sounds like that annexation really threw this whole agreement
Yeah.
into like a legal gray area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you had some experts saying, no, this was a legally binding treaty.
Okay.
They pointed to the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties.
Okay.
And this convention basically says, even if something's not officially called a treaty,
Right.
if it's in writing, its states signed it,
Mm-hmm.
and if it references international law,
Yeah.
then it counts as legally binding. And they were saying the Budapest Memorandum, it checks all those boxes.
Interesting. So they've got a case there.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's another side to this whole legal argument.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
There were people saying, look,
Yeah.
the memorandum doesn't actually say that
Huh.
they have to take military action.
Okay.
It doesn't say that anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It just has assurances, not guarantees.
Right, right.
So it's more of a political promise
Yeah.
than an actual enforceable treaty.
So it sounds like a lot of this hinges on like very specific wording
Yeah.
and like interpretations of international law.
Right.
Did either side have like a stronger argument?
I mean, it's really hard to say.
Yeah.
The Budapest Memorandum was just kind of unusual in
Yeah.
its structure and wording. So you have all these legal disputes that are still going on today.
Wow.
It just shows how hard it is
Yeah.
to figure out what these agreements really mean.
Right.
And then how do you actually enforce them?
Yeah, especially when you're talking about powerful countries.
Especially then.
Yeah, and that's always the tricky part, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just Russia, the U.S., and the U.K.
Right?
There were those separate assurances from China and France, too.
Yeah.
Did those carry any weight in all this?
Not really.
Okay.
China's statement didn't even say they had to talk about it.
Oh, wow.
And France's didn't even mention consultations at all.
Yeah,
It was
interesting.
more like a we're watching kind of thing.
Okay.
Not really a we'll do something kind of thing.
Right. So even more ambiguity.
Yeah.
So after Crimea is annexed, the world's left wondering,
Right.
what does the Budapest Memorandum even mean anymore?
Yeah.
Was it a complete failure?
Right.
Is it just totally meaningless now?
I think those are the big questions everyone was asking.
I
I mean,
don't-
it's easy to say in hindsight.
Right.
Well, obviously
Yeah.
it didn't work,
For-
but it's just way more complicated than that.
right.
And then, of course, 2022 happens.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Here we go. This is where things really escalate
Right.
with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Talk about throwing a wrench in the works.
Talk about it.
What does this mean for the Budapest Memorandum?
Well, it really took that debate to
Yeah.
a whole other level
Right.
before it was this theoretical thing
Right.
about international law and broken promises. And
Yeah.
suddenly it was about people's lives. Yeah.
It was about what was happening on the ground in Ukraine.
It wasn't about interpretations of assurances versus guarantees anymore.
Right.
It was about tanks rolling across borders.
Exactly.
In direct violation of this agreement.
It was a very real, very tragic example
Yeah.
of what happens when a country just decides
Yeah.
they don't care about international agreements.
Right. So how did the different people involved react to this?
Yeah.
They must have had something to say about this whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
This complete disregard for the agreement they'd all signed.
Well, even before the invasion in 2022,
Yeah.
Putin had made some comments
Yeah.
questioning the Budapest Memorandum.
Like, what was he saying?
Well, he was particularly focused on Crimea.
And he basically said that Russia didn't see itself as bound by those commitments anymore.
Wow.
So it was pretty clear that they weren't going to follow the agreement.
So basically he was saying the agreement was null and void.
Pretty much.
What about Zelensky?
Yeah.
How did he and Ukraine respond to all of this?
Well, you can imagine he was pretty disillusioned.
Yeah.
Especially after the lack of support from the West in 2014.
Right.
And he actually publicly questioned whether the Budapest Memorandum was worth anything at all.
Wow.
He was basically saying that Ukraine hadn't gotten any real security from it.
Right.
He even went so far as to say
What's that?
that if the guarantor nations didn't step up,
Yeah.
Ukraine might have to rethink being a non-nuclear state.
Wow, that's a big statement.
Yeah.
It sounds like he was really desperate
Yeah.
to find some way to get through to Russia.
Yeah, you can see the position Ukraine was in.
Right.
They gave up their nuclear weapons.
Right.
And now they're facing this much bigger, more powerful neighbor.
Right.
And there's nothing to stop Russia.
It's almost like that whole thing.
Yeah.
If you want something done right, you got to do it yourself.
Exactly.
But was Zelensky seriously considering going nuclear?
I mean, there's no evidence that Ukraine actually had any plans to build nuclear weapons. But what he said really showed how desperate they were.
Right.
And how frustrated they were that these promises were broken and that things were just getting worse and worse.
It really goes to show you that when it comes to international relations, power often speaks louder than words. Even when those words are part of some big agreement.
Unfortunately, that's often how it goes.
Yeah.
The Budapest Memorandum, it kind of shows you how fragile these agreements can be.
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with countries that they're looking out for their own interests, even if it means breaking the rules.
Yeah, and not caring about international law.
Exactly.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah.
You have these agreements, but there's no real guarantee that anyone's actually going to follow through.
It makes you wonder if it's even worth the effort.
Right. Like, what's the point of all these agreements if they can just be ignored?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's an easy answer.
Right.
But even though it didn't really work out like everyone hoped, the Budapest Memorandum, it still matters.
Okay, how so?
Well, for one thing, it's a reminder that international relations are complicated and that it's really hard to get countries to keep their promises.
Especially on the world stage.
Right. Exactly.
Right? So it's more than just a cautionary tale then.
Right.
What else can we actually learn from this whole thing?
Well, I think it shows how important it is to be really, really clear in these international agreements.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about the difference between assurances and guarantees.
Right. Which seems kind of minor when you put it like that.
Yeah, you think, oh, it's just a word.
Yeah.
But as we've seen, it can make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's not just about intentions.
Right.
It's about making sure the agreements actually have teeth.
Exactly.
That there are consequences if someone breaks their word.
Yeah, you have to make it so that breaking the agreement is way worse than actually following through.
Gotcha. And the Budapest Memorandum wasn't just about security, was it?
No, you're right.
There's that whole economic side of it, too.
Exactly.
You mentioned before that it's supposed to prevent economic coercion.
Yeah, they didn't want Russia using its economic power to bully these other countries.
Right. To pressure Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan.
Right. And this is where things get a little fuzzy.
How so?
Well, because it's hard to define exactly what counts as economic coercion.
Okay.
And even harder to prove it.
Gotcha.
But over the years, Russia's definitely used its economic influence.
In what way?
Well, they've done things like mess with trade and manipulate energy supplies.
Right. So even with the agreement in place, Russia still found ways to throw its weight around.
They did. And that brings us to another big lesson.
Which is?
That these kinds of agreements,
they
need everyone to get involved to actually work.
So it's not enough to just have the agreement?
Right. You need everyone on board to enforce it.
And when that doesn't happen, that's when things fall apart.
Exactly like when Russia annexed Crimea. The response from the rest of the world, it was all over the place. Some countries imposed sanctions, but others weren't really willing to do much of anything.
It's like that saying, it takes a village.
Right.
Except in this case, it takes like the whole world.
Exactly. And getting everyone on the same page.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as complex as this.
Yeah.
That's really difficult.
It's a tall order for sure.
It is, but I think the Budapest Memorandum shows us that we can't give up on diplomacy.
Okay.
Even when things are really bad.
Yeah.
We have to keep talking to each other.
Right.
And trying to find solutions.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah. What can we take away from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest thing is when we're making these agreements, we need to think ahead.
Okay.
We have to try to anticipate what could go wrong,
right?
What loopholes might exist, and how we're actually going to make sure everyone follows the rules.
And that's not easy.
No, it's not.
But it's essential.
It is.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today about the Budapest Memorandum.
A lot of history.
Yeah, from its hopeful beginnings.
Right. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah, to where things stand today.
Yeah.
Which is complicated, to say the least.
Complicated is a good word for it.
But I think it's safe to say that you've now got a much better understanding,
I hope so,
of this agreement and why it still matters.
It's not just ancient history.
Exactly.
It's still relevant today.
And you know what? Maybe even more importantly,
what's that?
This whole deep dive.
Yeah.
It's giving you the tools to look at other agreements out there.
Right.
And to understand all the different things that can influence these global situations.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power.
It really is.
The more you understand about how the world works, the better prepared you are to deal with all the challenges that are coming our way.
So keep asking those tough questions.
Yes.
Stay engaged.
Absolutely.
And until next time.
Until next time.
Stay curious.